On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GBNews,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Today, we're discussing polling. One poll puts the gap between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss as narrower than was previously thought. Just how much can we trust it? We'll speak to an expert. On top of that, we're talking China, we're talking hustings, and we're talking sport. All that to come after the headlines.
A very good morning. 9:32, I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date today on GB News. A US drone strike has killed the leader of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Ayman al-Zawahiri, one of the world's most wanted terrorists, helped plan the 9/11 attacks and was Osama bin Laden's successor. President Joe Biden says he was killed in a counter-terrorism operation over the weekend in Kabul after evading the US for nearly 21 years. BP's second quarter profits have more than trebled amid soaring oil and gas prices. The energy giant reported a profit of nearly £7 billion. That's the highest in 14 years. That compares with £2.3 billion a year ago. Energy bills could reach more than £3,600 this winter. Consultancy Cornwall Insight says that's hundreds of pounds more than previously expected for England, Wales and Scotland. Rising prices are already affecting millions of households, with UK inflation at its highest rate in 40 years. The Tory leader candidate Liz Truss has promised a war on Whitehall waste if she becomes Prime Minister. The Foreign Secretary has pledged a leaner, more efficient civil service. Well, meanwhile, Rishi Sunak says his economic plan is one of the most far-reaching initiatives to cut income tax people have ever seen. Archie Battersby's life support treatment is set to be switched off at lunchtime today after his parents lost several legal challenges. Doctors say the 12-year-old is brainstem dead. Court of Appeal judges won't allow an appeal against their decision at the Supreme Court. Archie's parents say they'll continue to fight it. British Airways has suspended the sale of short-haul flights from Heathrow for at least a week. The airlines temporarily halted ticket sales for domestic and European services, saying it was in response to Heathrow's request to limit new bookings. Well, last month, Heathrow announced a daily limit of 100,000 passengers until mid-September. TV online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now let's head back to Tom for this morning's briefing.
Good morning, it's 9:35 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, the second leadership hustings has come and gone for the prime ministerial hopefuls, but how are each of them faring up among the public and indeed the Conservative Party membership? Well, a new poll is making waves this morning, suggesting that Liz Truss's lead over Rishi Sunak among members has narrowed. But can we trust it? And, crucially for the Conservative Party, how is each candidate faring against Sir Keir Starmer and the Labour Party? Well, who better to talk this through now than with the head of political polling at Opinium Research, Chris Curtis, live for us this morning in Westminster. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. Now, first of all, we should get into some of the broader polling. There's been some polling yesterday done by Redfield and Wilton Strategies showing the gap between Sir Keir Starmer and Liz Truss. Now, in this poll, it suggests that Liz Truss is 1 point ahead of Rishi Sunak, really climbing over the last few weeks. Viewers on television now can see a graph plotting how Liz Truss has been climbing against Starmer there. But also Redfield and Wilton looked at these numbers for Rishi Sunak. And looking at Rishi Sunak's numbers, he has dipped slightly below Sir Keir Starmer. He's around 6 points below Sir Keir Starmer in that head-to-head. Now, Chris Curtis, how much do these numbers, these head-to-head numbers, matter when it comes to looking at future general elections?
Well, I think firstly it's worth noting that your first comment is true. It is certainly true that Liz Truss's polling ratings have improved quite substantially over the past few weeks, particularly among those who voted Conservative at the last election. Basically, as Conservative voters have got to know Liz Truss, they've started to like her. And that's one of the reasons why she's now beating Keir Starmer in those head-to-head races. I mean, in terms of what it means for the next general election, I'd say probably not very much. Liz Truss is probably at this stage going to become Prime Minister in September. When she becomes Prime Minister, she's going to have an opportunity to set her vision out for the country. She's probably going to have a honeymoon period, but she's also going to face severe headwinds, problems with the cost of living crisis, problems with the NHS, problems with the economy. And ultimately, how she ends up dealing with those as Prime Minister is going to be the biggest question for the next general election, not how popular Liz Truss is right now.
Interesting point there. Now, you say that she's probably going to become Prime Minister. Of course, 12 days ago, we saw a poll from YouGov that really set the narrative here, where Liz Truss had a 24-point lead over Rishi Sunak, beating him by 62 points to 38 points. Now, that was almost 2 weeks ago, that poll. But today we've seen an interesting poll reported in The Times. Now, this is by an Italian pollster, Tecne, I think they're pronounced, which shows a much narrower lead now for Liz Truss over Rishi Sunak. Just around 5 points is her lead, according to this new poll. Now, there's been a lot of discussion online about this poll, about how much we can trust it. We haven't seen this particular pollster organisation poll Conservative members before. What's your take on this particular poll and how it's been reported in The Times?
I mean, healthy scepticism is always a good thing. You know, a pollster's come out, they've said that they've polled Conservative Party members, they've got these results. We have to believe that that's the case until we're presented with substantial evidence implying otherwise. But, you know, there's very little you can tell, to be blunt, about a polling company and the way that they do stuff just based on what we can see online. You don't know how they managed to source this sample and whether there may be problems with that. You don't know what quality control procedures they've put in place. You don't know the approach that they've taken to weighting and sampling. So there's still lots of unanswered questions that I'd like to know the answer to before I can sort of confidently say that I trust these numbers. But ultimately at this stage, I'm still a lot more trusting of those pollsters who have done Conservative Party members polling before, like YouGov, or, you know, I back what we're doing as well because I know the methods that we're using. But ultimately, I'm a lot more trusting of them because they've got a record that they've stood by in previous elections.
So to some extent, this might be a bit of a surprising result that we've seen from this pollster who hasn't asked these kind of questions before. We might want to take it with a bit of a pinch of salt at this stage.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. I also think it would be, it'd be helpful if we got a few more details about how this poll was done, just to clean up some of these arguments that seem to be happening and to give people a lot more confidence in those answers. But yes, I mean, definitely take it with a pinch of salt, and you should always take outlier polls with a pinch of salt as well when they're showing something different from what the status quo, or from what the rest of the polls are showing, and that stands regardless of who's doing that polling.
Now, we have seen a lot of polls in terms of how the candidates are supposed to have done in these leadership debates. We've seen polling in terms of the issues, we've seen polling in terms of the country at large, but we really haven't seen many member polls at all, really. In terms of looking at the last 2 weeks, it's only that YouGov one about 12 days ago, and now this Techne one today, which seems to have been leaked to the Times in a very confusing way. The Times claiming that this was a poll commissioned by the Liz Truss campaign. I spoke to the Liz Truss campaign this morning, who say that they didn't commission this poll, although they had seen it, but they don't know who commissioned it. It seems like there's a lot of murky goings-on and not that much clear data.
Well, I mean, it's always a bit the case in Conservative Party elections. They're always a bit messy. We're going to be running another public opinion poll of Conservative Party members. That's going to be out next week, Tom, and I suggest you keep your eyes peeled for that.
Well, excellent. We will look out for that next opinion poll of... is that of Conservative Party members?
Yeah, that will be.
Fantastic. Well, good. I've been waiting for one of these ones that we can compare to previous polls. We'll look forward to that. We'll have to have you back on as soon as that's out. But for now, Chris Curtis, thank you very much for joining us live from Westminster there to try and clear up some of these ambiguous issues with polling. Well, now to an issue that we have heard much about last week, but has since faded in the Conservative leadership race. The growing influence of China in the world. Where do the two candidates stand on dealing with the world's next burgeoning superpower? Well, Rishi Sunak promised to close all of 30 of Beijing's Confucius Institutes in the UK and, quote, kick the Chinese Communist Party out of our universities. Sunak has declared China the biggest long-term threat to Britain. Meanwhile, Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has said she, quote, helped lead the international response to increased Chinese aggression and has pledged this will only continue when she becomes Prime Minister. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now live in the studio by Luke de Pulford, human rights activist, expert in modern slavery and human rights abuses in China and director of anti-slavery charity Arise. Luke, thanks for joining us. I suppose it was an interesting issue that this was brought up in those early debates. Liz Truss criticised Rishi Sunak's record on China. Then Rishi Sunak brought out a raft of policy in terms of China. Where do these two candidates broadly stand?
Well, I think you have to say on Rishi's part, this represents something of a dramatic U-turn. From his time in the Treasury underneath Rishi has been pushing for increased bilateral trade with China, despite the fact that sanctions were imposed on MPs, and despite the fact that things like the trade summits that he was wanting to start again were suspended when the national security law was imposed in Hong Kong. So quite a dramatic U-turn from Rishi, but what we're actually seeing from him is a very hawkish line, a very unexpected line, categorising China as the biggest threat. We haven't used that word in any of our foreign policy documents to describe China, and neither has Liz. So it's quite fascinating to see both candidates try to adopt the hawkish mantle from one another. I think in describing Liz, you've probably got to be a bit fair to her and say this is a long-standing concern of hers. Back when she was Trade Secretary, I was leading a campaign to try to stop the UK from engaging in free trade agreements with countries that were perpetrating genocide. Now, we knew that she personally agreed with that policy, but it was her bill, and she couldn't accept the amendment that was proposed. So there was a big battle that went on. And I think during that period, awareness in her mind was raised over what had been happening to Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims or minorities in the northwest of China. And I honestly believe that she was abhorred by it. And that has shaped, I think, a lot of her approach towards China.
I suppose she is, to some extent, held back from what she can say in terms of decreeing what is a threat and what isn't, because she is currently Foreign Secretary, and everything that she says on foreign issues, I suppose, is taken to be British government policy. Does that, to some extent, restrict what she can say?
I think it does, yes. For example, it was reported that she had said to the ERG at a hustings that if she was made PM, she would recognise that what was happening to Uyghurs was a genocide. That would be a very significant departure from UK policy on genocide, but also hugely deleterious to the bilateral relationship with China. So for her to do that is a really big deal. Now, this got reported, and what did we get from the Foreign Office? An attempt to try to roll back that line. You know, no, actually, the determination of genocide is a matter for international courts, which is their line. Liz personally believes it might be a genocide, but that's not government policy. That was the perspective. So I think that's the correct analysis. I think she has been held back. But I think you have to look at these two candidates in the round. This is the culmination of 2 years of very solid campaigning from the Tory backbenches. You know, we have a bit of a phrase, every bill is a China bill, until the government changes its policy and wakes up to the challenge that China presents to us at the moment.
So looking at Rishi Sunak's pledges specifically, what do you make of them in terms of, are they particularly different from what Liz Truss is saying? He's brought out a number of fairly specific pledges, not just on Confucius Institutes, but also, of course, on Chinese investment into strategic UK infrastructure and the like.
I think what Rishi's pledges are lacking is coherence. So the difficulty is that the Treasury under him signed off a line around China which is just fundamentally contradictory. So we say that China is a systemic challenge, and we say that the way we're going to deal with that is to invest more in it. That doesn't make any sense. You don't invest more in your systemic competitors. You don't invest more in threats. But there's no indication that Rishi is saying that bilateral trade with China should be affected, or that we shouldn't be having these trade summits, which he was pushing for. I don't see how you can say that at the same time as say, we need to stop all this dangerous investment. It's not terribly coherent, but I think that that's an accusation you can make of both parties. We need much more depth when it comes to China policy.
Now, last week on this programme, I spoke to an expert in China who was a bit worried about this promise to close down Confucius Institutes. It's grabbed a lot of headlines, but to some extent, the argument went that these Confucius Institutes help British students learn Chinese. In order to combat a potential threat, you do need to understand that language, that culture. You do need to know your enemy. Is that not a significant line?
Yes, and I think I substantially agree with it. There's a real issue here, which is that if we close Confucius Institutes and we get rid of the possibility of Chinese students coming together, and there is a very large group of Chinese students in this country, what we're doing is we're taking away from them something that they might need. The ability to come together, the ability to develop and express their culture and their people in a different place, in a different university. On top of that, the thing that worries me more is we make them responsible for the behaviour of Xi Jinping's Chinese Communist Party, which is wrong. However, we have to acknowledge that Confucius Institutes have got a problem. You know, they very often act under the direction of Chinese embassies. They foment nationalist sentiment. We can't have that kind of thing. So we should accept the principle that there should be some coming together within university of Chinese students. We should support that. But we shouldn't support that if it's going to result in nationalist sentiment and doing the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party in our universities.
Interesting stuff there. Well, no doubt we will see a bit more on this as this contest goes on. But for now, Luke de Pulford, thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really interesting stuff there. Now, Liz Truss has won the backing of the former leadership candidate Penny Mordaunt and the West Midlands Mayor Andy Street in her campaign for leadership. But one poll today shows that the race may be less sewn up than was thought. And at last night's hustings in Exeter, both candidates were quizzed on all sorts of issues: immigration, policing, Scottish separatism, and the rest of it. Truss criticised the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, saying she's an attention seeker who should be ignored. But let's speak to one of those MPs backing the former Chancellor Rishi Sunak. Jillian Keegan is Minister of State for Care and Mental Health and joins us now from College Green, just outside Parliament. Jillian Keegan, are you heartened by the suggestion of this poll that shows that maybe, just maybe, the lead that has been assumed of Liz Truss has been diminished somewhat?
Well, sure. I mean, you know, if you go from 2 weeks ago, it was, I think, a 24-point lead, and I think yesterday they said 5-point lead, then obviously that's going in the right direction. However, I think it's also very clear that it's a very difficult electorate to poll because it's Conservative members and you need to kind of know who they are. So I think it is also difficult to poll. But I think we sense going around the country as Rishi's getting more and more to lots of events actually that we're all putting on, as well as the formal hustings, that he's getting very, very good feedback on the ground. And I think the survey from the councillors also showed that it was much more equal than perhaps some of the press or polls have suggested in the past.
Yes, the councillor survey seemed to match the MPs' voting intentions a little bit more closely, although I suppose when it comes to membership, it's a very, very tricky art to poll, I suppose. Looking at endorsements, however, it does look pretty clear that the momentum is on the side of Liz Truss. We've seen the Mayor of the West Midlands and a number of her former leadership opponents, I suppose. We've seen Penny Mordaunt, we've seen Nadeem Zwahi, we've seen even Tom Tugendhat come out in favour of Liz Truss. What does that say about the party and its ability to coalesce around Rishi Sunak were he to win?
Well, I think what you've got to remember is Rishi got many, many more MPs supported him from the beginning, plus more cabinet and former cabinet ministers. Plus, I think he's the only candidate that has both two former leaders of the party who've obviously got nothing to gain by giving their opinion, plus most of the former chancellors back in his plan as well. So we've got Michael Harwood, we had William Hague yesterday, as well as many existing and former cabinet ministers. But he was already a long way ahead in terms of both existing MPs and others backing him. And I think Ben Houchen, who's the Tees Valley Mayor, who has worked very, very closely with Rishi on levelling up, backed him many, many weeks ago before, backed him based on what we see as opposed to looking at polls and how popularity may be going.
Well, to move on from polls and on to policy, which I'm sure many, many people want to see primarily in this race, Rishi Sunak has been accused of U-turning, not once, but twice on tax, saying that, of course, initially he wouldn't want to be cutting any taxes before inflation was brought under control, and then now announcing that first he'll cut VAT before inflation is brought under control, and then setting out a 7-year programme for cutting income tax, whether or not inflation, almost irrespective of where inflation is. We've got this timescale for tax cuts. Is that not a U-turn? Is that not inconsistent from the position he set out with?
Not at all. So first of all, what you've got is very clearly we need to tackle inflation first, grow the economy, and then cut taxes. In terms of the VAT cut, I think even when Rishi was Chancellor and he turned up and gave £37 billion of help for families who were obviously suffering at the huge energy hikes, he said then if it went up, he would look again in the autumn budget. So I think that's consistent that the VAT cut, which will give another £160 to families, is short term. It's just a one-off and it's there for a limited period to help with those energy bills whilst we get over this crisis.
But Jillian Keegan, why is that?
You will fuel inflation and mortgage tax rates.
Why is that any different from Liz Truss's promise to temporarily, for a short period of time, similarly, abolish those green levies on energy bills? Isn't that basically the same sort of promise? And that's something that Rishi Sunak attacked Liz Truss for offering at the start of this campaign.
Yeah, I don't know the cost of that, but I think the bigger tax reversal that Liz has promised is the reversal of the NI rate, which is about £17.4 billion a year. So I think the 55 billion or more of unfunded promises that Liz has made in this campaign are things that obviously now she's trying to work out how to fund, which I think is why she's announced more cuts to pay for civil servants and other public sector workers.
What does Rishi Sunak believe when it comes to the pay of civil servants? Of course, there's a bit of disparity at the moment between what people in the public sector and what people in the private sector are paid, particularly in some regions of the country that might be described as more left behind. Is it fair that public sector employees are paid so much more on average than private sector employees in those parts of the country?
Well, actually, that has been changing. And I think the biggest thing to remember, Tom, is there's 1.3 million vacancies in the country right now across many job types. What we're actually really focused on is skills, and that was something I worked with Rishi in my old role as Apprenticeships and Skills Minister. That really is focused on making sure people have the skills so they can access the higher paid jobs in the private and the public sector.
Well, Jillian Keegan, thank you so much for talking through not just the polling, but the policy of this race as it hots up and indeed gets more exciting than potentially we thought just a couple of days ago. Jillian Keegan, thank you very much for joining us here on The Briefing. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, that's it for the show today. Thank you for joining me and talking through those important issues. It's getting to be a very exciting summer. Well, up next, it's To The Point, and I'll be back tomorrow morning at 9:30. But for now, I'll leave you with the weather forecast.
Hello, a very good morning to you. I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. It's a gloomy and in places damp start to the day. A breezy day to come as well, but that breeze coming from the southwest will make it feel humid, and in fact it's going to be a hot day in the southeast. Now, weather fronts have been moving in across northern and central parts of the country overnight, and they'll continue to progress eastwards. They contain a lot of cloud and some heavy rain at first, especially for northern England into North Wales, that continuing through the morning before eventually easing away to the east. Nevertheless, it stays cloudy, it stays breezy, it stays damp in places, particularly northern and western England as well as Wales. Brighter skies for Scotland and Northern Ireland, a few showers in the far northwest where it will be fairly windy here, but towards the southeast, well, avoiding the rain once again and hot and humid with temperatures reaching the high 20s, even 30 Celsius. Low to mid 20s widely across the rest of the UK. And into Tuesday evening, we keep the cloud, we keep the breeze, and as a result, temperatures aren't going to fall very far on Tuesday night. So a warm, uncomfortable night for sleeping for many. And it will stay damp across northwest Scotland into northern and western England as well as parts of Wales. So we start off Wednesday with temperatures of 18 or 19 Celsius, a lot of cloud cover, again a breezy start, risk of gales for exposed parts of northern Scotland first thing. Through the day, an area of, well, showery rain will push across southwest England, South Wales as well, before moving into the Midlands as well as southern counties of England. Not a great deal of rainfall associated with this, and to the far southeast it stays very warm, 28 Celsius. Cooler for Scotland and Northern Ireland, temperatures back towards 18 to 21 Celsius. And Thursday and Friday we'll see that cooler air spread to all parts, but it also turns drier and brighter with just some scattered showers, mainly in the north.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly